This is the moment a professor nobody in Washington wanted to listen to was proved completely right. Not partially right, not right with caveats, right in every detail, down to the timeline, the method, and the players, in a way that makes the silence around his warnings for the past 6 years one of the most expensive intelligence failures of this generation. His name is Professor Jiang. He is 67 years old. He taught strategic geography at Fudan University in Shanghai for 28 years before retiring in 2021. He published a paper in 2019, a paper that was translated into English, circulated inside the State Department, flagged by 2 CIA analysts, and then quietly shelved, in which he argued with precise and uncomfortable specificity that China did not need to fight for control of the Strait of Hormuz. It only needed to make itself indispensable to the one country that already controlled it. If you look at what is unfolding across the Persian Gulf this week, Saturday, April 19, 2025, you will see Professor Jiang's 2019 paper playing out in real time, chapter by chapter, like a script that one side wrote and the other side refused to read. As of 9 a.m. Tehran time, Saturday, April 19, 2025, Chinese infrastructure, Chinese financing, Chinese naval coordination protocols, and Chinese diplomatic architecture are now embedded so deeply inside Iran's Hormuz strategy that separating them would require Iran to dismantle its own defense structure from the inside out. This did not happen in 24 hours. It did not happen in one agreement. It happened over 9 years of patient, deliberate, invisible construction, while Washington was busy watching Iran and completely forgot to watch what China was building around Iran. Iran never surrendered Hormuz. That was always the wrong question. The right question, the one Professor Jiang asked in 2019 and nobody answered, was this: what happens when Iran doesn't need to surrender it because someone else has already guaranteed it will stay in Iranian hands forever? That question has now been answered, and the answer has changed the strategic map of the entire Middle East. In this deep analysis, we are going to walk through exactly how China built this over 9 years. We are going to show you what Professor Jiang saw that Western analysts refused to see. We are going to expose the infrastructure, the financing, the military coordination, and the one decision made in Beijing in 2016 that set everything else in motion. And we are going to explain why this is not a crisis that can be solved with sanctions, statements, or naval deployments. China did not take the Strait of Hormuz. It grew into it. And now it cannot be removed without tearing out the walls. In 2016, China made a decision that most Western governments classified as an economic move and moved on. Beijing announced a $400 billion 25-year comprehensive cooperation agreement with Iran. The official framing was simple: Chinese investment in Iranian infrastructure in exchange for guaranteed oil supply, roads, railways, ports, telecommunications, energy projects, the kind of deal that development economists write reports about and security analysts skim. Professor Jiang, who was still teaching at Fudan at the time, read the agreement differently. He noticed something in the infrastructure list that nobody else was publicly discussing. Buried in the port development component was a clause authorizing Chinese state-owned construction firms to upgrade 3 specific Iranian port facilities: Bandar Abbas, Jask, and Chabahar East. All 3 ports sit within 80 kilometers of the Strait of Hormuz. All 3 were described in the agreement as dual-use civilian and emergency logistics infrastructure. In military planning language, dual-use port infrastructure means one thing: it can support naval operations. Professor Jiang published a short commentary in a Chinese academic journal in 2017, arguing that the port clauses were the strategic core of the entire agreement, that everything else was packaging. He was not widely read outside China. By 2018, Chinese construction teams were on the ground at all 3 ports. By 2019, the upgraded facilities at Bandar Abbas could handle vessels 3 times the size of anything Iran's Navy operated. By 2021, Jask Port had been expanded to include deep-water berths specifically engineered for destroyer-class warships, a class Iran does not own. The port was being built for ships that had not arrived yet. Professor Jiang wrote his 2019 paper with one central argument: China was not investing in Iran. China was pre-positioning. building the physical infrastructure of a strategic relationship that would only become visible when it was activated. And by the time it was activated, it would be too late for anyone to dismantle it without Iran's active cooperation. Cooperation Iran would have no reason to give. The paper was translated. It was read. A senior State Department official who reviewed it at the time reportedly described it as interesting but speculative. The official who wrote that note retired in 2022. Professor Jiang's paper is now being recirculated inside every major Western intelligence service this week with a single word annotation added at the top, confirmed. At 6:15 a.m. on Wednesday, April 16, 2025, a Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy Type 052D destroyer, hull number 173, named Jiang, entered the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz. It was not the first Chinese warship to transit the strait. China has conducted Gulf of Oman exercises before. What made this different was not the ship. It was what happened on the ground simultaneously on three separate fronts. First, while the Jiang was transiting the strait, Iranian port authorities at Bandar Abbas activated a new vessel traffic management system. This system, installed in 2023 by a Chinese state-owned technology company under a contract described publicly as a port modernization initiative, gave its operators the ability to coordinate maritime traffic across both Iranian sides of the strait from a single command interface. For the first time in history, one control room, staffed jointly by Iranian and Chinese operators, had a real-time operational picture of everything moving through the Strait of Hormuz. Second, while the traffic management system went live, a second Chinese vessel, a Type 901 replenishment ship, entered the Gulf of Oman and anchored 40 nautical miles from the strait's eastern approach. Replenishment ships are the logistical backbone of sustained naval presence. You do not send a replenishment ship to a location unless you plan to stay. The message to anyone tracking naval movements that morning was clear. This is not a transit. This is a deployment. And third, while the naval deployment was establishing itself, Iran's state broadcaster aired a 47-minute documentary at prime time. The documentary, titled The Partnership of Centuries, featured Professor Jiang speaking directly to camera, retired, calm, and precise, walking through the history of the Sino-Iranian relationship from 2016 to the present. It had been filmed 3 weeks earlier. Its broadcast on that specific morning was not a coincidence. Pause. Because what the documentary did in real time was provide the public narrative for an event that was already happening in the water 300 kilometers away. Iran was not announcing a crisis. It was announcing a completed architecture. The professor was not warning about the future. He was explaining the present to an audience that was only now catching up. By 10 a.m., the financial response was already registering across global markets. Brent crude jumped 7.8% in morning trading, its fastest single morning move in 18 months. The Japanese yen weakened sharply as traders priced in elevated energy costs for Asia's most import-dependent major economy. Gold rose $67 per ounce in 4 hours as institutional investors began rotating toward hard assets. 3 major shipping companies, all European, issued emergency notices to their vessels in the region, requesting they hold position and await further guidance. While television anchors were still debating whether the reports were accurate, insurance markets had already decided. Hormuz transit risk premiums doubled before noon. The markets understood what the politicians were still arguing about. The rules of the waterway had changed, and the change was permanent. According to documents reviewed by a German investigative outlet and corroborated by 2 independent regional sources, the activation timeline for the Hormuz framework was finalized not in April 2025, but in November 2024, 5 months before it was deployed. We have learned from a source with direct knowledge of the planning process that the November meeting involved 4 participants: a senior member of China's Central Military Commission, the commander of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, a Chinese state enterprise executive overseeing the Bandar Abbas port contract, and a third-country intermediary described only as a Gulf-based facilitator with long-standing ties to both governments. The topic of the meeting was not whether to activate. That had already been decided. The topic was sequencing. specifically the order in which the components would become visible so that the full picture would only emerge after each individual piece was too established to remove. Sources familiar with the sequencing plan describe it as follows. The port infrastructure becomes fully operational first. That happened in late 2024 and drew no significant Western attention. The traffic management system goes live second. That happened April 16th and provided operational coordination capability. The naval vessel arrives third, visible, undeniable, but by then anchored in infrastructure that already exists and cannot be removed by protest. The public narrative, Professor Jiang's documentary, goes live simultaneously with the naval arrival, ensuring that the first story the world reads is not China invades Hormuz, but China fulfills a 9-year partnership. The sequencing was designed to make every individual step look either routine or already accomplished. By the time the full picture was clear, objecting to any part of it meant objecting to something that had been in place for months or years. A senior European intelligence official, speaking anonymously to a French publication, described the operation this way. They did not build a trap. They built a house, and they invited Iran to live in it. And now the house is finished and everyone else is standing outside wondering when the construction started. The answer, according to Professor Jiang's own timeline, is 2016, 9 years ago, before most of the officials now responding to this situation were in the positions they currently hold. Why did China invest 9 years and enormous resources into this specific strategy? Follow the architecture, because it reveals something far larger than the Strait of Hormuz. China's core strategic vulnerability, identified in internal planning documents that have leaked in fragments over the past decade, is what Chinese military planners call the Malacca Dilemma. More than 80% of China's imported oil transits through 3 narrow maritime choke points, the Strait of Malacca, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Bab el-Mandeb. All 3 are within range of U.S. naval interdiction in the event of a serious conflict. In a confrontation over Taiwan, for example, America's most powerful economic weapon against China would not be sanctions. It would be closing those 3 choke points and cutting China off from its energy supply. China has spent the past decade building responses to that vulnerability. The Belt and Road Initiative, pipelines through Pakistan, railways through Central Asia, port investments across the Indian Ocean, is not primarily a development program. It is an energy security program. Every Chinese infrastructure investment in the region answers the same question. How do we move energy to China if America closes the sea lanes? The Hormuz framework answers that question for the Persian Gulf in a way that no pipeline or railway can. If China has operational presence inside the strait itself, not just near it, not just adjacent to it, but embedded in its traffic management and physically present in its waters, then closing Hormuz to China means closing it to everyone, including the countries whose economies would collapse before China's if the oil stopped flowing. This is not China taking a waterway. This is China making itself the waterway's co-landlord. The legal and strategic implications of that position are completely different from any military seizure. Historically, what Professor Jiang called infrastructure-based strategic embedding has no real modern precedent at this scale. The closest comparison is British naval strategy in the 19th century, not conquest, but the quiet accumulation of coaling stations, port rights, and communication infrastructure that made British presence in every ocean feel less like occupation and more like furniture. Furniture that everyone had learned to arrange their lives around. China has just placed very expensive, very permanent furniture inside the Persian Gulf's most critical room. The legal position is, by design, nearly unassailable. Iran invited China. The infrastructure is civilian in designation. The naval vessels are operating under a bilateral security agreement between 2 sovereign states. International maritime law provides no mechanism for a third party to object to a bilateral naval cooperation arrangement in territorial waters. The State Department's legal team has spent the past 48 hours confirming what most international law scholars already know. There is no legal lever to pull here, only a political one. And China designed this specifically so that pulling the political lever would cost America more than it would cost China. Here is the domino sequence, and understanding it requires thinking 9 years ahead, not 9 days. If China's embedded presence in Hormuz becomes normalized over the next 6 months, and normalization begins the moment the second Chinese vessel arrives, which sources say is already en route, then every government in the Gulf must recalculate its security relationships from the foundation up. If those recalculations produce even 2 or 3 significant shifts toward Beijing, the American security architecture in the Middle East, built over 50 years, maintained through billions in arms sales and military bases and naval patrols, faces structural redundancy. If that architecture becomes redundant, the financial flows tied to it, the petrodollar arrangements, the arms purchase agreements, the dollar-denominated oil contracts begin to migrate toward whatever replaces it. We are looking at the potential beginning of the most significant reorganization of Middle Eastern security since 1973. In Riyadh, sources describe an atmosphere of intense and urgent private diplomacy. Saudi leadership is simultaneously managing American pressure to denounce the Hormuz framework and Chinese reassurances that the arrangement poses no threat to Saudi interests. The Saudis are doing what they always do when forced to choose between Washington and Beijing, publicly saying nothing while privately gathering information. But the window for saying nothing will close. It always does. While Gulf capitals are recalibrating, there is a fracture opening inside the American foreign policy community that goes deeper than political disagreement. On one side, the hawkish response: deploy additional carrier groups, impose secondary sanctions on Chinese firms involved in Hormuz infrastructure, and force Beijing to choose between its Gulf ambitions and its American trade relationships. The argument is that strength deters further encroachment. On the other side, the structural argument that responding with military posturing validates China's framing of the situation as a confrontation drives Iran further into Beijing's orbit and risks alienating Gulf states who are watching America's reaction to determine whether Washington is a reliable partner or an impulsive one. The argument is that the right response is not louder, it is smarter. Both sides have credible voices. Neither side has a clean answer. And while Washington argues internally, Beijing is already preparing the framework's second phase. Sources within 2 Asian diplomatic missions confirm that China has quietly approached a second Gulf state about a port cooperation arrangement using identical language to the 2016 Iran deal. The identity of that state has not been confirmed, but the template is being replicated. Reports from journalists with access to Iranian government sources describe Professor Jiang himself as having been in Tehran this week, not as a private citizen, but as part of an official Chinese academic delegation. He was seen entering the foreign ministry on Thursday morning. He did not give press interviews. He did not need to. His documentary had already said everything that needed to be said to an Iranian public that has watched his predictions come true in real time. When the man who predicted the future shows up the week his predictions are confirmed, it is not a coincidence. It is a signal. China is telling Iran and everyone watching that this was planned, that the planning worked, and that the planning continues. Professor Jiang's 2019 paper ended with a sentence that his editors at Fudan's academic journal almost cut because they thought it was too dramatic for a scholarly publication. He wrote, "The Strait of Hormuz is not a door to be kicked open. It is a garden to be grown into, and patience is the only tool that has ever worked in a garden. The garden is now grown. The roots go 9 years deep, and nobody who is only now picking up a shovel is going to pull them out. That is the metaphor of this moment. Not a battle won or lost, not a line crossed or defended, but a garden that was planted while the neighbors were arguing about the fence. The fence argument is still happening. The garden is already producing. You can close borders, you can impose sanctions, you can position warships, but you cannot uproot infrastructure that was built legally, financed through bilateral agreements, operated by a sovereign state in its own territorial waters, and embedded in the daily functioning of a waterway that 21 million barrels of oil transit every single day. Reality does not wait for permission. It was grown, and now it is here. So where do we stand? China has achieved in 9 years what no military operation could have achieved in 90. It has made itself structurally necessary to the security of a waterway it does not own, using tools, investment, infrastructure, trade, and a patient diplomat's calendar that no international law prohibits and no military response can reverse. Iran has secured what its leadership has demanded since the revolution: permanent, guaranteed control of its most powerful strategic asset, backed by a partner with enough economic and military weight that threatening Iran means calculating the cost of threatening China simultaneously. And Professor Jiang, the 67-year-old retired geography professor from Shanghai, who wrote a paper nobody wanted to read in 2019, has been proved right in the most complete and public way possible. He did not predict a crisis, he predicted an architecture, and the architecture is standing. As we move through the coming weeks, watch for 3 specific developments that will tell you whether this framework holds or fractures. First, watch whether a second Chinese naval vessel joins the Jiang inside the Gulf. That would transform a deployment into a rotation, which transforms a presence into a permanent station. Second, watch Saudi Arabia's language in its next joint statement with the United States. If the language becomes noticeably softer on the question of Chinese regional activity, Riyadh has already made its private calculation. Third, watch Professor Jiang. If he gives a public interview, any interview, in the next 2 weeks, listen to what he says about the second phase, because if there is a second phase, he will have written about it already. Somewhere. The irreversible has already happened. The infrastructure exists. The vessels are in position. The agreement is signed. The documentary has been broadcast to 85 million Iranian viewers. The sequencing that began in 2016 has reached the stage its architects designed it to reach. 9 years of preparation, 72 hours of visible deployment, and a retired professor watching from a television screen in Tehran, answering the one question that everyone in Washington is now furiously asking each other. How did we not see this coming? He told you. In 2019, in a paper that is now the most forwarded document inside 3 separate Western intelligence agencies. Subscribe and stay close. We are tracking Professor Jiang's movements in Tehran and will report the moment he makes any public statement. We are monitoring Chinese naval vessel movements in the Gulf in real time. And if that second Chinese warship crosses into Hormuz waters, our sources say it is currently in the northern Arabian Sea, we will break it down the moment it happens. This is not a regional dispute. This is the opening move of the century's most important strategic competition. Watch closely. Read the papers that nobody wants to read. And remember, the garden was already growing while everyone was arguing about the fence.